And now we get a panel about the policies that fostered successful projects. And the panel's being moderated by Beverly Craig from Massachusetts, with panelists Sarah Lewis from the UK, Illya Azaroff from New York, and Sean Pander from Vancouver, BC. Welcome all.
And now we're going to be on to a discussion of policies that have made these kinds of projects possible. We have a really great panel of movers and shakers in Scotland, New York, and Vancouver now that have been involved in passive house policy. So panelists, I'd like to have you quickly introduce yourself and start us off by telling us about the specific policies in your region that have been most effective in promoting passive house adoption.
Hello, thank you for inviting me to join the panel today. We're so excited to be part of this really ambitious event. So my name is Sarah Lewis. I'm Research Policy and Education Director at the UK Passive House Trust. And I have a background as an architect and passive house consultant. My current role at the Trust encompasses a pretty broad remit. So the Passive House Trust is an independent organisation that leads the charge for the adoption of the Passive House Standard and its methodology in the UK. So our primary goal is to really champion passive house as an exceptionally effective approach to ensuring superior occupant comfort and health, while simultaneously drastically reducing energy consumption and carbon emissions from buildings across the UK. Should I just continue sort of to answer this question in full before we introduce the other speakers? Is that the best thing to do, Bev? Yeah. So given my base kind of outside North America, I hope that the experience that we have in the UK offers a bit of a unique perspective that might be of interest to the discussions today, and something maybe a little bit different. I only have 2 minutes, and I know Anne-Marie Fallon has spoken a bit about the schools programme through the SFT in Scotland. So instead, I'm just going to focus on the Scottish Passive House equivalent standard for new homes. Which I do think will be sort of an interesting thing to sort of add into the discussions. So it all began in Scotland at a kind of political level back in about 2020 when we held a Citizens' Climate Assembly. And I'm not sure if all the other regions have a citizens' assembly kind of structure. So just to bring everybody up to speed with this concept, these assemblies are made up of around like 100 people who are representative of the wider population. And the idea is that they provide a kind of cross-section of or cross-sector of society, bringing everyone together to talk about issues. So this assembly included engineers, healthcare workers, parents, grandparents, so really diverse group of the population. And then the assembly itself serves as a platform for people to kind of come together, engage, debate things, and then draw their own conclusions on a topic. So Scotland's Climate Assembly was held over 2020 and 2021, and it focused on determining kind of effective and equitable approaches to tackling the climate crisis for Scotland. And an overwhelming 97% of participants advocated for the adoption of Passive House or its Scottish equivalent standard for new construction projects in Scotland. So I think it was a really fantastic kind of catalyst for change. And in response to the report, the Scottish Government stated that the Assembly has had a profound impact within government, giving the government a mandate to act on some of the most challenging areas and opening a door for new conversations, which are now taking place across government. So I think it would be fair to hold the Scottish Citizens' Assembly up as being a very effective way to promote policy change and bring Passive House into the conversation in Scotland. So I promote that as an approach for other regions around the world.
Thanks, Sarah. Illya, do you want to go next?
Sure, happy to. Well, it's great to be here today. I appreciate the invitation. My name is Illya Azaroff. I'm an architect, and I'm the founding principal of Plus Lab Architects. I'm also an educator at the City University of New York City Tech campus. And lastly, I serve on the AIA National Board of Directors. And a lot of the work that I've been doing is with climate adaptation over the span of my 30-plus year career. What really started everything here in New York really has to do with Hurricane Sandy. So we always have this idea is that you don't let disasters go to waste because they are a moment of transformation. In fact, when you have such great disruption, you really have to recognize that rules no longer apply. So this idea of building back better was put forward from Hurricane Sandy. How do we build back better all of these affected neighborhoods? And you fast forward, and we have the Climate Mobilization Act here, which encompasses 6 pieces of legislation, including Local Law 97. And that really applies to buildings over 25,000 square feet, and there's some other pieces to it. And it really is geared towards leveraging utility consumption reduction to transforming buildings for better, right? All electrification is another piece of legislation that passed here in the city. And then aiming all of this towards moving towards new energy distribution models as well. So if you put those all together, you really have a formula by which the profession, the building industry and developers, and building owners really need to comply to what a new standard might look like. And so Passive House is one of those vehicles by which you can recognize the pathway forward. And as proof positive, NYSERDA, the energy authority for the state, has a Buildings of Excellence Challenge that highlights the best buildings that really comply with where we want to go for the future. So that's another place that really has not just what we should do, but what it looks like. And I think that's important as an architect and lawmakers to see those things come forward. Thanks.
Thanks, Illya. And Sean, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Yeah, like the other speakers, it's great to be here. I think we move so much more quickly in addressing our challenges when we have dialogues that combine policymakers as well as the private practitioners, because I think we learn from each other so much more quickly. Anyhow, my name is Sean Pander. I'm the Green Resilient Buildings branch manager with the City of Vancouver, and I lead the team at the city responsible for decarbonizing new and existing buildings, privately owned buildings throughout the city. And we began acting under council's mandate in 2015 to regulate all new construction to be zero emissions by 2025. So we had less than 10 years to figure out how to do it and then make it happen. And what we looked at was, given 98% of our electricity is renewable, almost all of the emissions in buildings come from the combustion of fossil gas for heating and hot water. We started looking around in North America, and North American energy standards were never going to get us there. They weren't moving quick enough, and they weren't structured to focus on greenhouse gases. But what we learned is we were introduced to Passive House as a tool, and then we began to realize, that created the ideal regulatory structure. Focusing on heat loss and renewable energy was exactly what we needed to decarbonize our built environment. So we wanted to start to normalize the use of Passive House. And so we started introducing policies to encourage Passive House design, construction, and supply chains. Now, in a dense urban environment like Vancouver, land prices are very high. Buildable area is more valuable than gold. And so we started initially, because there was some hesitance within the bureaucracy, we started relatively modestly, and we looked at the things that prohibited people or discouraged people from building high efficient envelopes. And what we did was we introduced exclusions for if you were building extra thick walls to accommodate extra insulation, or if you were installing really high heat recovery or energy recovery ventilators. We recognized those took up more space. So we allowed a floor space limit exemption for those buildings that were pursuing Passive House to make them kind of whole in those regards. And then we started looking at how these projects actually move through a process, and we began to just accept, if you were building Passive House, you didn't have to use standardized models. We would accept a Passive House model as meeting our requirements. I think we really began to accelerate once we started providing staff training. We really, one of the things we loved about Passive House is it made sense to the public. It wasn't a complex, abstract idea. It made sense. but it made sense to builders, architects, our permit processing staff. Everyone can comprehend what we were trying to do and why. And so we started to provide that staff training, and that was from sort of half-day introductory training for sort of intake clerks to more extensive, the more comprehensive trades training for building inspectors, so that when they were on site, they could recognize why people were doing something different. But what that started to do was, fix some of the internal small process problems that the policy folks don't normally get to see. And then I think the big thing that really kicked it into high gear is once people started to understand and get comfortable with the exclusions, and the training helped to do that, then we moved into providing actual additional buildable area, between 5 and 8% extra area, to overcome some of the, the challenges of the extra design costs, the sort of not as competitive supply chains, to recognize there were some extra costs, but we could start to normalize those practices, and we had to accommodate some of that extra risk and cost through increased density, which means they could sell more occupiable floor space. Thank you.
Fascinating, different approaches. I guess that's sort of a follow-up question. The policy in your regions, what do you think, have you learned anything from your experience so far? And are there things in particular that you would lead into or suggest people avoid?
Thanks, Bev. That's a really interesting way to follow up the kind of introduction everybody gave. Sean, I really like that it just makes sense to everybody. And I feel like that's the thing I think we have to lean into, actually. It's just like, it makes sense. So that's the message we need to get out. I think the biggest lesson that we can kind of draw on from our policy experiences is that, as Sean said, it's universally applicable. It makes sense. The Passive House principles kind of work for all projects. And one of the big things we wanted to get across at an early stage in the discussions was just that Passive House is not a brand. It's building physics. And if you follow building physics, it means the building's going to work. And that makes it kind of much more accessible. And then you show that because it's just building physics, it's also effective in any region in our country, but also worldwide, as we can see through this whole event that's going on at the moment. And I think that kind of fundamental understanding has been really pivotal in Scottish government embracing Passive House as a kind of approach for its new homes. It could see that it was building physics and it works. We're also witnessing this kind of remarkable growth globally. So we can point to that and say, look, designers all around the world are turning to this standard to shape the buildings of tomorrow, because everyone agrees this is a good way forward. So yes, you're being forward thinking, but you're also following something that's really tried and tested. And then, we can point to buildings in our own region as well, from homes to community structures to educational facilities to retrofit projects. And these Passive House initiatives are really becoming pretty kind of common sites now, and we can all get access to them. So I do think that there is a pressing need to kind of amplify those success stories, and then also use those to persuade policymakers of the immense wide benefits that Passive House projects offer. And for me, something I've been thinking about a lot recently is that we have to have this kind of critical shift in perspective. We need policymakers to stop kind of pondering the extra cost of Passive House and instead get them to consider the cost of not doing Passive House. So, for instance, transitioning to Passive House standards in the UK could potentially save £20 billion in energy infrastructure investment over the next 2 decades. And then equally significant and arguably much more important are the health and well-being benefits for the population at large. So Passive House, with its kind of focus on superior indoor air quality and thermal comfort, reduces the need for medical attention, which results in fewer school and work absences and results in a more productive population. So what politician doesn't want to support that as a message? And then there's already well-documented links in the UK, and I'm sure internationally, between cold homes and poor health. And fuel poverty in the UK costs in Scotland, it's something like £80 million annually. In England, which is much larger, it's about just under £900 million annually. So, you know, that current cost of living crisis that we're all living through as well has upped those numbers, because those numbers are the latest numbers I could find were all pre that as well. So this is something which is on the rise. These costs are on the rise, and this is a way to mitigate those. And then additionally, sort of a final thought on health is that there's a real impact, and we're seeing more and more evidence on this as well, between poor ventilation and poor health. So I feel like that can't be overstated as well to our politicians enough, that, you know, we can see that our new homes through monitoring have inadequate ventilation, which is leading to concerning levels of CO2 and therefore other particulates and VOCs. And studies have shown that poor ventilation is associated with now a range of health issues, from things like asthma that we've all kind of intuitively could imagine, right through to dementia. So really big topics. So I think we've got to get that message out about the Passive House standards, not only enhancing overall well-being, but also being able to alleviate the strain on decarbonising energy grids and on our healthcare services, which makes them a really prudent sort of investment for any region anywhere in the world.
Illya?
Yeah, Sarah, that's a great summary. And look, I'm in agreement with you because we need to be the change we want to see in the world. And talking about the benefits through the lens of resilience and ESG is really important. My advice to folks out there is to really look at, given the shocks and stresses, whether it's extreme temperatures, high wind storms, the ROI on Passive House is excellent. As an architect, health, safety, and welfare is my calling. So the passive survivability and life safety that Passive House offers you is extraordinary. Couple that with other programs out there that are in alignment, such as IBHS Fortified, those types of things. It gives you the opportunity to really have the ability to move your communities forward. So I think that's something. I did a project in that Build Back Better program after Sandy, and we had an 83% insurance reduction just based on the quality of construction, and a 72% energy reduction from the prior house that stood there to the one that came out of the other end. So there's proof positive for this. Use those artifacts to your lawmakers to show that you can do this and why it's beneficial. And then the last thing that I would say to that question is that the opportunity for partnerships with the city, whether you're a design professional or come from the industry, it's really extraordinary because there's a lot of new services that are needed around this. Training of the design professional is one thing, but training of contractors, this is a complete new methodology of assembly. And traditional trades need that to be done to be efficient in the construction and delivery and keep waste reduction down. So building and code officials also have to be trained to recognize what it looks like in the application process. Am I seeing the energy model correctly? What does it really look like? So think of these as opportunities. And then the last one is banking and finance. I've told you about the ROI, but there truly is, on the developer side and on the city side, the banking and finance, floating bonds, all of those pieces, if you're putting this in there, you can benefit from the banking and finance side as well. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Illya. Sean, do you want to wrap us up?
Yeah, I think, one of the things, well, I guess it was our intention right off the bat was we recognized that Passive House was a really important tool, not only because it made sense, but what we were really aiming for was to normalize the excellence, to show that there were people in the private sector that could do this, were doing it repeatedly. And by normalizing excellence in design, construction, and supply chain, it made the conversation about where we set the regulation much easier, and we could move it much further to where we wanted to end up much more quickly. Because again, it was hard for other people that maybe weren't as familiar in the private sector to say, oh, that's crazy, that's way too hard. No, there are dozens and dozens of projects that they could go visit, they could go talk to the architects or talk about the design challenges and the construction challenges. I mean, so again, like Sarah and Illya said, though, not only was it a great tool to normalize excellence to meet our, greenhouse gas and energy objectives, I think a big aha moment came when we were taking some of the councillors and my general manager a tour of one of the early multifamily passive house projects in the region. And everyone was having a hard time. It was right off a busy urban corridor, travel corridor, and some emergency vehicles were going by. And you know, the speaker was, we were in a suite, and it was just getting drowned out. And so I walked over and I closed the windows, and all of a sudden, you know, 4 out of the 6 faces of the counselors and my GM just sort of like, it was like a revelation, because it was so quiet. And they like that, yeah, they were very committed to our climate and energy objectives, but realizing, you know, that it did that indoor air quality, and in an urban setting, it was so much more quiet. I think that connection of what you're trying to achieve with more tangible, immediate benefit for occupants really helps, you know, kind of the abstract. Everyone knows we need to do something about this, with the very immediate, oh my God, people will be living in better environments. So I think that was really important. And I guess I'd end with just, you know, my recommendation to other regulators is, if you want to rapidly transform your building industry and your codes, I suggest you find, then you feed, and then you follow the private sector leaders. You know, you find the people that are trying to build the way you want to build. We didn't try to come up with a big city branded program and, you know, get people to pay attention. We saw people already trying to build passive house, which is exactly the way we wanted to regulate. And so we fed them. We put oil on the fire, as it were, so that, you know, there was already a spark of an idea. And you know, we removed those regulatory barriers, those process barriers, and we provided incentives. And then, you know, we followed them. We just kept moving the code and lowering the maximum heat loss, the thermal energy demand intensity. We just kept lowering that number, lowering the greenhouse gas, which, you know, pushed to the, you know, renewable energy requirements, I guess, within passive house. And so that just really helped us. We found the leaders, we fed the leaders, we stopped throwing them in jail, and then we followed them.
So Sean, that is so funny. I have an almost identical story about closing a window that you have. And Sarah, I think your comment about that this is the right way to build, it's the quality way to build, that this is the physics, and it's not that hard to sell. I guess I just want to close, all of you building practitioners who are out there listening. I know policy can sound intimidating at times, but I think all of us here have the same stories about, it's the people who are the building practitioners who are best at communicating why this is the right way to build. And we need you to be involved in policymaking. I mean, you can make a difference on your 4 or 5 buildings, or maybe it's 100 buildings in your lifetime. But if you get involved in policy, you can transform the market. So please get involved. Come talk to us if you haven't before. And thank you, panelists. Like, it's such a pleasure to hear what's going on elsewhere besides outside of Massachusetts. Lots of great, fantastic stories. Thank you.